Hello. We've had a few questions this week on self-isolation and the extension to those requirements to self-isolate in a couple of different scenarios, one being travel abroad and the other being the government's new test and trace system. So looking at travel overseas to start with, it's been announced that the government will introduce a 14-day quarantine period for most people arriving overseas from the 8th of June. Everyone travelling to the UK will need to fill in an online form to provide their journey and contact details before they travel, and there may be checks at the UK border to ensure this has been completed. Now, when somebody returns to the UK, they'll need to self-isolate for 14 days, except for a limited number of exceptions. Anyone failing to comply may face enforcement action, a £1,000 fixed penalty notice, or prosecution, and an unlimited fine can be imposed, and those rules will be reviewed every 3 weeks. So as things stand, that's coming in. There has been significant pressure from the tourism industry in particular to resist that, but for now, we have to expect that that will come in. So the common question from the client this week has been, what if an employee does decide to go on holiday? Many people will have holidays booked. They will have committed quite significant costs to those. May not be able to get it back if the FCO advice is not necessarily not to travel. So can an employer insist that somebody doesn't go abroad? There's no simple answer to this. I would start on the basis that an employer has to act reasonably in every decision that it makes, and instructing an employee what they can and can't do with their own leisure time may be unreasonable. However, from the employer's perspective, if an employee is taking 2 weeks off and there is then the prospect of having to quarantine for a further 2 weeks, that is unlikely to be very palatable for the employer, especially if there is work to be done. It's not so relevant to employees who are furloughed because they might well be off anyway, but for employees who are required to be in work, 4 weeks away might be a significant struggle. So they might want to speak to the employee and issue an instruction not to take that holiday. I wouldn't suggest they're in a strong position to take severe disciplinary action or dismiss if an employee does take that leave. What they can do, however, is require an employee to remain on either unpaid leave or possibly statutory sick pay. We're just waiting for some clarification on that. So there's no obligation on the company to offer full pay unless a contractual sick pay scheme is drafted in such a way that you're obliged to do so. It's possible that SSP would be triggered because this is arguably deemed incapacity and it's pursuant to an enactment, so an instruction in law that an employee should self-isolate, or the government may introduce new regulations which state that SSP is payable. If an employee becomes stranded overseas following a holiday, again, no obligation on the employer to pay for any time that an employee is not working. If they're subject to lockdown, it's likely that the employee is going to have to take unpaid leave or request further annual leave to use. So in addition to that requirement to quarantine, to self-isolate, we do have the test and trace system which has now been launched. So those who test positive with symptoms of COVID-19 are then required to notify public health authorities of those who they've been in close contact with, in order that they can be instructed to self-isolate as well. Contact tracers will make contact with those individuals who need to self-isolate, and they will, if there is a positive test, they'll have to self-isolate for 14 days. Not a requirement for the household to self-isolate, but for the individual who's been in contact with the positive case. It is clear now, following further regulations, that employees who are required to self-isolate on this basis will be entitled to statutory sick pay. The question is whether or not those employees will be keen to notify their employer in circumstances where it may result in quite a significant drop in income. Obviously, those who are working from home, there may not be too much impact, but it is important to be aware that the number of employees who are being asked to stay at home is likely to increase, and that will affect your workforce planning. Thank you.